Our most unusual creatures right now at the San Diego Zoo in our reptile house. It's drawing raves.
A tiny monkey climbed onto one of the most famous heads in America. Live. On national television. In front of millions of viewers. And then it did something nobody in the studio could have possibly scripted. The audience lost their minds. The crew couldn't hold it together. And the host, the king of late night himself, sat there with the most perfectly helpless expression on his face.
Sometimes if we might shake it up like this.
What happened next became one of the most replayed moments in the history of American television. And it was just one night on The Tonight Show. Tonight, we're counting down the 10 funniest, wildest, most jaw-dropping animal appearances in the history of Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. These are the moments that had audiences screaming with laughter, that made Carson completely lose his composure, and that proved over and over again that no script in the world can compete with an unpredictable animal on live TV.
I give up! Because I'm show business, folks.
From baby gorillas causing chaos, to pythons wrapping around hosts, to orangutans that simply refused to leave Carson's arms, every single one of these moments is real, documented, and absolutely unforgettable. Stay until the end. Because the number one moment on this list is the one that started it all, and it involves a very small primate and a very unfortunate accident. But before we get to number one, the moment that Joan Embery, the woman who brought most of these animals onto the show, still laughs about to this day, we need to go back to the beginning. Because to understand why these segments became legendary, you have to understand the man who made them work. And to understand the man, you have to understand what he built.
Angry, temper, the animal is usually...
John William Carson was born on October 23, 1925, in Corning, Nebraska. He would go on to host The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson from 1962 all the way through 1992. 30 years. 30 years of late-night television. 30 years of making America laugh before bed. By the time the 1970s arrived, Carson wasn't just a television host. He was an institution. He was the last voice millions of Americans heard before they fell asleep. And he had a gift that very few people in show business have ever truly possessed.
What am I?
He could make anything funny. A bad joke. An awkward silence. A technical failure. But the greatest source of unscripted comedy that Carson ever discovered wasn't a comedian, a celebrity, or a writer. It was an animal. The animal segments became a recurring feature of the show during the 1970s and 1980s. Unlike celebrity interviews, which were polished and rehearsed and predictable, animals were completely, beautifully, chaotically unpredictable.
And sleepy.
Carson understood this instinctively. He realized that an animal doing something unexpected on live television was better than almost any joke his writers could put on a card. The two people most responsible for bringing that chaos onto his stage were Joan Embery and Jim Fowler. Joan Embery, born June 1, 1949, was an animal ambassador from the San Diego Zoo. Over the course of Carson's run, she appeared on the show nearly 70 to 100 times. Jim Fowler was a wildlife expert and host of Wild Kingdom. He appeared approximately 40 times. Together, they turned The Tonight Show into the most entertaining wildlife documentary ever made. Number 10, The Elephant Shrew That Fooled Everyone.
This territory is already taken.
It started with an animal that looked completely harmless. Small. Adorable. Fluffy enough to make the front row of the audience say "ah" the moment it appeared. The elephant shrew. Named for its long, flexible snout. Built like something you'd find in a children's picture book. Joan Embery placed it gently on the desk. The audience cooed. Carson leaned forward. He had that look he always had, curious, charmed, just slightly nervous, as if he wasn't quite sure whether to pet it or run. The elephant shrew sat there, looking impossibly innocent. And then Embery mentioned something that made the whole studio laugh. She said, "Johnny, I should warn you. These animals are actually incredibly aggressive." The audience erupted. Because nothing about this tiny, doe-eyed creature suggested anything remotely threatening. It looked like a toy. Carson stared at it. Then back at Embery. Then back at the animal. That thing? That thing, she confirmed. The studio exploded with laughter. Carson shook his head the way only Carson could, that slow, perfectly timed disbelief that made every joke land 3 times harder than it should have. Even the crew broke character. The clip became one of the quieter favorites among Carson fans. No dramatic action. No chaos. Just the gap between appearance and reality, and Carson's face perfectly capturing every second of it. But cute animals that surprised Carson were one thing. What came next was something entirely different. Number 9, the crocodile versus alligator showdown.
14 me, I'm hysterical. You never asked me, do I wear red?
Jim Fowler was not a man who did things halfway. When he appeared on Carson's show, he didn't bring pets. He brought animals that made the front rows of the audience quietly reconsider their seat assignments. The crocodile and alligator demonstration was, on paper, an educational segment. Jim was going to explain the differences between 2 of the most ancient predators on Earth. Carson sat at his desk, tie perfectly knotted, smile perfectly calibrated. He had done enough of these segments by now to know that educational on The Tonight Show rarely stayed that way. As Fowler described the differences in jaw structure and behavior, Carson kept his eyes on the animals the entire time. Not on Fowler. On the animals. Because one of them had started moving. Carson's commentary, delivered in that dry, perfectly measured voice, turned what should have been a nature lesson into a comedy routine. Every scientific detail Fowler offered, Carson found a way to twist into something the audience could laugh at. The snout length. The teeth arrangement. The fact that one of these creatures could outrun a human on land. That last one made Carson noticeably shift in his chair. The audience loved it. Not because of the animals alone, but because of the dynamic between Carson and Fowler. The wildlife expert trying to educate. The comedian trying to survive. Their chemistry was something that couldn't be manufactured. It was real. And the audience felt it. Jim Fowler's appearances became some of the most anticipated segments in Carson's run. He passed away in 2019, but his legacy as one of America's most respected wildlife educators lives on, and those Tonight Show clips remain among the finest pieces of accidental television comedy ever produced. But danger and comedy weren't the only things these segments delivered. Sometimes, they delivered something genuinely magical. Number 8, Bubbles the hippo.
Changed my life. I may go write a book, I may do all kinds of things about it.
You sound very...
1978, The Tonight Show stage had seen gorillas, pythons, and eagles. It had seen chaos. It had seen near disasters. It had seen Carson in various states of nervous laughter. But nobody was prepared for Bubbles. Bubbles was a baby hippopotamus. And if you have never seen a baby hippopotamus, allow us to describe it for you. It looks like someone designed a very large, very round, very slow-moving pillow and then gave it legs. The moment Bubbles appeared on stage, the audience's reaction wasn't laughter. It was something closer to pure, collective adoration. The entire studio seemed to exhale at once. But there was a problem. Because baby hippos, adorable as they are also enormously heavy, surprisingly fast, and absolutely indifferent to the concept of television staging. Bubbles did exactly what Bubbles wanted to do. Which was explore. The handlers tried to guide. The audience watched with the kind of focused delight usually reserved for the final moments of a sporting event. Carson watched with that familiar expression, equal parts enchantment and mild alarm. When Bubbles eventually settled, the audience applause was thunderous. Not for any particular action. Just for existing. Just for being there. Just for being Bubbles. Carson shook his head and smiled the way he always smiled when an animal completely stole the moment from him. Genuinely. Warmly. Without a trace of ego. The Bubbles segment is still described by Carson fans as one of the purest, most joyful moments in the show's long history. No drama. No disaster. Just a baby hippo and a studio full of people falling completely in love. But love wasn't always the emotion these segments produced. Sometimes, the emotion was raw, undiluted chaos. Number 7, the twin orangutans who refused to leave.
Now these are orangutans. Now I know these are orangutans.
And we have raised
Twin orangutan babies. That sentence alone should tell you everything you need to know about why this segment ended up being completely impossible to control. Joan Embery brought them onto the show with the intention of talking about orangutan conservation, the intelligence of great apes, and the important work being done at the San Diego Zoo. Carson had done enough animal segments by this point that he had developed what might generously be called a system. A loose, improvisational, largely fictional system, but a system nonetheless. He would ask the questions. Embery would answer. The animals would behave. 2 out of 3 wasn't bad. The twin orangutans had their own ideas about what this segment should look like. Specifically, they wanted to explore every inch of Johnny Carson. They climbed. They investigated his tie. They examined his microphone with the seriousness of engineers inspecting a prototype. One of them appeared to be attempting to remove his cufflinks. Embery kept trying to continue her educational commentary. Carson kept trying to respond. Neither of them could finish a sentence. Because every time Carson opened his mouth, an orangutan turned to look at him with those enormous, curious, completely intelligent eyes, and the audience lost it all over again. The laughter in the studio that night was the kind that builds on itself. Every time it started to die down, one of the twins did something new, and it exploded all over again. Carson eventually gave up trying to conduct an interview and simply surrendered to the moment. Which, it turned out, was exactly the right move. The twin orangutan segment remains one of the most shared Carson animal clips. Not because of a single dramatic moment, but because of the sustained, rolling, completely uncontrollable joy of watching 2 small primates systematically dismantle a live television interview. But if twin orangutans could dismantle an interview, imagine what one very large snake could do to an entire segment. Number 6, the giant python.
off at that end.
I think, yeah.
There are animals that make audiences laugh. And then there are animals that make audiences hold their breath. The giant python did both. When Jim Fowler brought it onto the stage, the silence in the studio was immediate. Not the polite, attentive silence of an audience watching a guest speak. The different kind. The kind that happens when several hundred people simultaneously decide that they are very grateful to be sitting where they are sitting, and not where the handlers are standing. The python was enormous. Its body moved with that slow, deliberate, completely unhurried confidence that large predators possess when they have absolutely nothing to prove. Fowler talked. He explained. He educated. Carson watched the snake. And then the snake started moving toward Carson's desk. Carson's reaction was precisely, perfectly Carson. He did not scream. He did not run. He did not make a scene. He simply leaned back very slightly, maybe 3 inches, and delivered a line so dry and so perfectly timed that the audience response shook the studio. He said something to the effect that he had interviewed a lot of guests over the years, and none of them had looked at him quite like that. The audience erupted. The tension broke. Fowler laughed. Even the handlers grinned. And the python continued doing exactly what it had been doing the entire time, moving with complete, magnificent indifference to everything around it. The python segment is remembered not for chaos or disaster, because there was none, but for the quality of Carson's fear. Controlled. Acknowledged. Turned immediately into comedy. It was one of the purest demonstrations of what made him a once-in-a-generation television personality. But reptiles weren't the strangest things to appear on the Tonight Show stage. Not by a long shot. Number 5, the two-headed snake.
Teeth, and they eat rodents, and this one's called a corn snake.
A corn
And
snake.
1991, The Tonight Show was in its final years. Carson was nearing the end of his legendary run. But the animal segments had never stopped delivering. Joan Embery arrived with something that, even for a show that had hosted gorillas and crocodiles and baby hippos, was genuinely unusual. A two-headed snake. Let that settle for a moment. A snake. With 2 heads. Both of them functional. both of them looking around. Both of them completely unaware that they were sharing a body and a television appearance. The audience reaction when the animal was revealed was one of those rare studio moments where laughter and shock arrive at exactly the same time. Carson stared at it. Then he looked at Embery. Then back at the snake. His commentary was precisely what it needed to be. He asked the question every person watching at home was already asking: how does it decide which direction to go? Embery, ever the professional, explained that the two heads sometimes disagreed. Carson nodded slowly, as if this were the most reasonable thing he had ever heard. Then he said it reminded him of more than a few production meetings he'd sat through. The audience loved it. After nearly 3 decades of these segments, Carson's ability to find the perfect line had never dulled. He was sharper at the end than most comedians are at their beginning. The two-headed snake appearance is documented in IMDb episode records and remains one of the most frequently referenced moments from the final years of Carson's show. A fitting reminder that even at the very end, The Tonight Show could still produce something nobody had ever seen before. But strange as it was, the two-headed snake was a quiet moment compared to what had come before. Because some of the greatest animal segments in Carson's history involved animals that didn't just surprise the audience, they surprised the entire building. Number 4, Carol the Elephant.
That's very good. Oh, that's very
What are you expecting for you?
Most animals on The Tonight Show were small enough to fit on a desk or in a handler's arms. Carol was not most animals. Carol was an elephant. And the logistics of getting an elephant onto a television stage and then getting an elephant off a television stage represented one of the more ambitious production decisions in the show's history. According to Johnny Carson archives, Carol's appearance was one of the largest animal appearances in the show's history. The studio had to be prepared. The stage had to be reinforced. The handlers had to be briefed. And Carson, as always, had to be Carson. The moment Carol walked onto the stage, the audience reaction was unlike anything a smaller animal had ever produced. It wasn't just laughter or surprise or delight. It was awe. Pure, collective, genuine awe. Carol moved with a grace that was entirely inconsistent with being an elephant on a television set. She was calm. She was curious. She was, by every available account, an extremely professional guest. Which somehow made the whole thing funnier. Because Carson, standing near an animal that outweighed him by approximately 4,000 pounds, maintained the same composure he always maintained. Slightly nervous. Deeply curious. Completely in command of the room. The audience gave Carol an ovation that the show's human guests would have envied. The cameras caught the faces in the front rows, people who had come to watch a talk show and found themselves 6 feet away from an elephant. Every one of them was grinning. Carol's appearance remains one of the most visually spectacular moments in the show's history. A reminder that The Tonight Show was capable of producing television that no other program on air would have even attempted. But spectacle alone was never what made these segments great. The greatest moments were the ones that felt genuinely human. Like the one coming up next. Number 3, Baby Oliver the orangutan who hugged Johnny Carson. There are moments in television that make you laugh. And then there are moments that make you feel something you can't quite name. Oliver was a baby orangutan. And he had, from the moment he arrived on the Tonight Show stage, absolutely no interest in being handed back to his handler. He wanted Johnny Carson. Embery introduced Oliver with her usual mix of expertise and warmth. She talked about orangutans. She talked about their intelligence, their emotional range, their remarkable similarity to humans in ways that scientists are still working to fully understand. And then Oliver, apparently having heard enough, climbed directly into Carson's arms and stayed there. The studio went quiet for just a moment. Not the silence of shock. The silence of something unexpected and genuinely tender happening on live television. Oliver held on. Carson held back. And for a moment, the king of late night, the man who had interviewed presidents and rock stars and the biggest names in the world, sat there looking at a baby orangutan with an expression that had nothing to do with comedy. It was just warmth. Carson joked that Oliver looked, and this is a famous line from the segment, a little stoned. which broke the tenderness and brought the laughter flooding back. But the audience response wasn't just laughter. It was something bigger. The kind of sound a studio audience makes when something unexpected and genuinely moving happens in front of them. Oliver continued to hold on. Carson continued to let him. Even the crew, the people who had seen everything, who were professionally obligated to remain unmoved, were smiling. The Oliver clip remains one of the most shared Carson animal videos on the internet. Not because of chaos. Not because of disaster. But because of one small animal deciding, with complete and utter certainty, that Johnny Carson was where it wanted to be. And Carson, for once, had nothing to add. The moment said everything. But the most famous animal moment in Carson's career wasn't tender. It wasn't quiet. It was loud, it was immediate, and it involved a very specific biological function happening in a very public place. Number 2, the baby gorilla episodes. Before we get to number 1, we need to talk about the gorillas. Because no single appearance captures everything that made Carson's animal segments legendary quite like the recurring gorilla visits of the 1970s. Gorillas are extraordinary animals. Intelligent. Emotionally complex. Physically powerful in ways that the word powerful doesn't quite capture. Baby gorillas are all of those things, with the addition of being completely, magnificently unpredictable. The first gorilla appearances in the early 1970s established a template that would play out across the decade: introduce the animal, attempt the educational segment, watch everything go sideways. The 1975 New Year's episode featuring gorillas is still discussed by fans as one of the show's most chaotic nights. The gorillas did not respect the set. They did not respect the format. They did not respect the concept of a structured television program. What they respected, apparently, was Johnny Carson. Multiple gorilla appearances ended with the animals finding their way to Carson and refusing to leave, not unlike Oliver the orangutan, but with considerably more physical confidence. Carson would sit there, a gorilla settled comfortably against him or exploring his desk, delivering commentary that walked the perfect line between genuine delight and theatrical alarm. He never oversold the fear. He never undersold the comedy. He just reacted. Honestly. Perfectly. The audience for these segments didn't just laugh. They cheered. Because by the mid-1970s, they knew what was coming. They knew things were going to go wrong. And they couldn't wait. That anticipation, that collective, joyful expectation of chaos, was something no scripted segment could ever manufacture. The gorilla segments became one of the most replayed portions of Carson's career. They're featured in Carson compilation DVDs and regularly appear in retrospectives about late-night television. By 1977, several gorilla appearances occurred that are now considered among Carson's funniest moments. Each one built on the last. Each one found new ways to create the same perfect comedy. And all of it, every gorilla, every orangutan, every hippo and python and two-headed snake, built toward the single most famous animal moment in the history of The Tonight Show. Number 1, the marmoset that peed on Johnny Carson, live on television. A pygmy marmoset is one of the smallest primates in the world. Its body is roughly the size of a human fist. Its tail is longer than its body. Its eyes are enormous relative to its head, giving it the permanent expression of something that has just witnessed a minor miracle. Joan Embery has brought hundreds of animals onto The Tonight Show over the years. But the pygmy marmoset visit is the one people still ask her about. The one she still laughs about. The one that, by any objective measure, is the single most famous animal appearance in the show's history. The segment started normally. Embery introduced the marmoset. She explained what it was, where it came from, what made it remarkable. Carson was, as always, attentive. Curious. Leaning in slightly. The marmoset was, as always, completely indifferent to the concept of live television. It looked at the cameras. It looked at the audience. It looked at the lights. And then it looked at Johnny Carson's head. There is a moment, visible in the clip, where the marmoset makes a decision. You can see it happen. The tiny head turns. The enormous eyes focus. And then the marmoset climbs onto Johnny Carson's head. The audience reaction was immediate. But the real moment, the moment that made this segment immortal, was still about 5 seconds away. Sitting on the head of the most famous television host in America, live on national television, in front of millions of viewers, the pygmy marmoset did what pygmy marmosets do when they have claimed something as their territory. It urinated. On Johnny Carson's head. On live television. In front of millions of people. The studio audience did not just laugh. They erupted. The kind of laughter that a studio produces maybe once or twice a year, the completely uncontrolled, physically overwhelming kind that makes people grab their neighbors and point. Carson's reaction was everything. He did not scream. He did not jump up. He sat there, with the marmoset still on his head, and delivered the single most perfectly timed facial expression in the history of late-night television. Complete. Utter. Helpless disbelief. Joan Embery later explained that the marmoset was doing something entirely natural, marking its territory. Johnny Carson's head had, in the eyes of a pygmy marmoset, become the most important piece of real estate in the building. Even the crew broke. Completely. The cameras shook slightly because the people operating them couldn't hold still. Carson kept joking through the entire incident. Of course he did. That's what Carson did. He made everything funny. Even this. Especially this. The marmoset clip is, by almost universal agreement, the most famous animal mishap in Tonight Show history. It has been referenced in documentaries, retrospectives, late-night tributes, and countless conversations about Carson's ability to handle the truly unexpected with grace and humor. Joan Embery would go on to appear on the show nearly 70 to 100 more times after that night. Because Carson kept inviting her back. Because every single time she came, something happened that no writer's room could have invented. And because that, more than anything else, was what The Tonight Show was really about. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years. He interviewed thousands of guests. He delivered tens of thousands of jokes. But ask anyone who grew up watching him what they remember most, and somewhere in the conversation, an animal is going to come up. The marmoset. The gorillas. Oliver. Bubbles. The python. The elephant. The two-headed snake. These weren't just segments. They weren't just comedy. They were proof that the best television, the kind that stays with you for decades, happens when you stop trying to control everything and let the world do what it actually does. Unpredictable. Chaotic. Honest. And funnier than anything anyone could have written. Joan Embery is still recognized today as one of America's most respected wildlife ambassadors. The animal she brought onto that stage helped introduce millions of Americans to species they had never seen, never heard of, and never thought about. Jim Fowler passed away in 2019, but his legacy as a wildlife educator endures, and his Tonight Show appearances remain some of the finest accidental comedy in television history. And the clips themselves, the marmoset, the gorillas, the hippo, the orangutans, all of it continue to circulate through official Carson archives, streaming services, and social media. Watched by people who weren't alive when they aired. Shared by people who want someone else to feel what they felt when they first saw them. That's the thing about great television. It doesn't expire. It doesn't fade. It just keeps finding new audiences. Decades later, people are still watching a tiny primate claim the top of Johnny Carson's head as its personal territory. And they're still laughing. Just like the studio audience did. Just like the crew did. Just like Carson himself did, because even he, in the end, couldn't keep a straight face. Moments like these are the reason people still remember the show. Not the celebrity interviews. Not the monologues. The moments that nobody planned. The moments that nobody could have planned. The ones that reminded us every single time that the funniest things in the world are the things that happen when you stop expecting them. Which of these moments was your favorite? Was it the marmoset? Oliver the orangutan? The gorilla chaos of 1975? Or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments below. And if you've seen any of these clips, drop a timestamp, we'd love to know which one got you. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to Faded Archives, because there are a lot more stories like this one. Stories about the moments that television history almost forgot. We'll see you in the next one.